It is clear from the scenario that Nick wants to succeed in his sporting activity and in everyday life. However, in doing so, he builds up high levels of stress. Stress is a stimulus which typically results in a positive or negative response to a specific situation. It will have a positive effect up to a certain extent. However, after the optimum amount of stress is reached, it will cause the person to perform worse than usual, as it will typically cause lower concentration levels and high agitation. However, this is thought differently in different theories and supported in others. Stress was described by Lazarus and Folkman in 1984 as being a pattern of negative physiological states and psychological responses which occur in situations where people perceive threats to themselves and do not feel comfortable. Stress is usually thought of in relation to an imbalance between the demands of the situation encountered by an individual and the ability to cope or adjust to these demands of the stimuli. Stress is the body's initial scene reaction, being either good or bad, to a situation that causes changes or irritability to physical, mental, or emotional states. There are two types of stress, which are eustress and distress. Eustress is positive and gives a feeling of fulfillment and arousal, good arousal. It can increase focus, attention, and skill level. Some athletes actively seek and need stressful situations, which causes eustress because it will make them more focused and determined in their sport. Figure 1 shows that eustress causes optimum arousal and also has the most positive effect on performance in athletes. This is because there is healthy pressure to succeed, which motivates players to push themselves. In Greek, eu has the meaning of well or good, and therefore it suggests that healthy stress, that eustress is healthy stress and positive for people and leads to optimum arousal, and it gives the pressure which pushes athletes to succeed but doesn't tip them over into severe worrying stress. For example, Ronaldo quoted, "I like living with pressure because it forces him to work harder and want to succeed." However, there is a type of stress called distress, which is physiological. Distress is an extreme form of anxiety, nervousness, apprehension, or worry, and it is the result of high levels of built pressure and is a result of perceived inability to meet demands. Scenario 1 shows that Nick is experiencing distress rather than eustress. This is because it is clear that he gets very anxious before games and feels nauseous before, which shows that this is causing physiological worry for him, and therefore he gets somatic distress. The stress that Nick puts on himself is so great that when he makes an error, his performance falls apart. And this shows that the stress which he is experiencing and putting on himself is very unhealthy, which is the opposite to what eustress would do to him, which is positive. There are many symptoms of stress which come under the categories of somatic, which is physiological, cognitive, which is the mental effect, and finally behavioural symptoms of stress. Examples of somatic responses are blood increases to the muscles and increased breathing rate to oxygenate the muscles, and in times of stress this is typically a fight or flight response and is where the body prepares itself to leave quickly from the situation, hence the more oxygen to the muscles to produce energy. Cognitive responses consist of sleeping disturbances and narrowed attention. Nick struggles to play the more accurate and precise shots, which could be an example of cognitive disturbance and a loss of focus to have the ability to succeed. Examples of behavioural symptoms are stress are lethargy and fidgeting and trembling. Nick physically can adapt. Nick physically can't adapt new tactics when he plays, which could show a behavioural sign of stress. Anxiety is known as a negative state of worry and apprehension which causes tension, which typically occurs in the presence of a real or obvious danger. The tension that anxiety and the anxious individuals experience is accompanied by a heightened state of physiological arousal. This theory was suggested by Buckworth and Dishman in 2002. Anxiety is a negative emotional state which is associated with increased arousal. It comes with having feelings of apprehension, fears, and worries, and is caused by situations which are seen as threatening because we doubt our ability to cope with them. Stress is a current reaction to the stimuli, whereas anxiety is a reaction to something that may or may not happen at a future date that a person will be thinking about for a while and building up anxiety. For example, as the new coach tries to reassure him, Nick, and say how good he is and how well he should be doing for the college, this may just build up more anxiety for Nick as he applies lots of pressure to succeed, and will cause him to worry about future and upcoming games. There are many different types of anxiety which a person can experience. These include somatic, cognitive, trait and state, and competitive anxiety. Trait anxiety is typically thought of as an inbuilt proneness to worry, and is a personality disposition that is stable over time. High levels of trait anxiety are likely to cause a person to become worried in a variety of situations. Sufferers most commonly overreact and become highly aroused quickly. High versus low trait anxious people usually have more state anxiety in highly evaluative situations. Nick shows high levels of trait anxiety as it describes that he is constantly worrying. For example, he constantly feels nauseous before games, which shows that he's very anxious, and furthermore, he worries about his grades. In contrast, state anxiety refers to the more current and right now feelings which change from moment to moment and only in certain situations. State anxiety is temporary and a response to any situation considered to be threatening. State anxiety can be cognitive or somatic. Nick doesn't experience this type of anxiety because he does always constantly worry about certain factors, and these are not just occasionally. Cognitive anxiety is the mental component of anxiety. It is associated with worrying and fear of negative evaluations of performance. The negative expectations and concerns about one's ability to perform and the possible consequences to failure. This was theorized by McNally in 2002. Cognitive anxiety is the amount you worry in your head. The emotional feelings which come with this anxiety include worry, apprehension, inability to concentrate, and negative thoughts. So, Nick also suffers from this type because the apprehension he feels before games and about his homework cause him to have very high levels of worry. As cognitive anxiety is brought on by stress, the pressure he puts on himself will therefore cause this anxiety. There are different factors which affect anxiety. There are personal factors which include trait anxiety, self-esteem, and social physique anxiety, which lead to a person bias situation interaction. and situational factors which affect it are important, and certainly also leads to person by situation interaction, which results in state anxiety or arousal. Arousal is a physiological and psychological activation which varies on the continuum from deep sleep to intense excitement, said Weiberg and Gould in 2007. Arousal is a mixture of physiological and psychological activity within a person, and it refers to the level of motivation, alertness, and excitement at a particular moment in time, said Weiberg and Gould. Arousal is linked to motivation or drive to perform, or prepares the body for action, such as fight or flight. It shows the function of the ANS, SNS, and PNS, and is linked to CNS, which we have evolved, which includes the fight or flight response, and RAS regulates levels of arousal and monitors levels of situation. There will always be different arousal levels for different athletes, and this can be good or bad. Beginner athletes tend to have lower levels of responsibility and stress, and so will typically perform at a lower arousal state than a professional athlete, which will have higher arousal levels as they require lots of motivation and preparation for powerful performances. The drive theory was created by Null in 1951, and this theory was one of the most early and most simple explanations of arousal that there are in existence. It suggests and proposes a linear relationship between arousal and performance, and is shown how increased arousal level leads to increased performance, and therefore there is a positive correlation between these two factors. This is shown by figure 2 on the PowerPoint. Nick has initially very low arousal levels and lacks in motivation and confidence. Throughout the drive theory, this would suggest that Nick's limited arousal will cause him to perform at a lower level than someone with high arousal levels. This can also be linked to the fact that he cannot seem to incorporate his coach's tips into his performance because he isn't very switched on during and has low concentration to the game. Different sports require different arousal levels. In a game of rugby or football, a higher arousal level will lead to increased strength, power, and aggressiveness, which is beneficial to the overall performance of players and therefore affects the outcome. Many athletes and teams rely on sports psychologists to help them develop the mental skills needed for reaching peak performance. There is supporting evidence as well as criticisms about the drive theory. It is true for experienced performers that increased arousal leads to increased performance, and therefore it is true for well-learned skills where the dominant response is the correct one, and it's the same for simple gross motor skills. However, it is a poor explanation for inexperienced performers as they don't get to experience high levels of arousal. The theory assumes that low arousal means poor performance, and it is poor for novice performers where dominant response is incorrect. Optimal arousal is a physiological term which refers to a level of mental stimulation at which physical performance, learning, or temporary feelings of well-being are maximized and increased.